I'm Ed Amoroso from Tag Cyber, and I'm here with Tony Pepper, who is the CEO and co-founder of Egress. I want to welcome you, Tony, to New York City.
Nice to see you, Ed. It's been a while.
It's great to see you. Hey, we're going to talk about protecting data and sharing data. You and I were chatting. There's this spectrum of risk from things that are okay to share, things that clearly not.
Right.
Talk to me about that. That's a fascinating topic, maybe a good way to get started.
Yeah, so the spectrum of risk in our experience is quite a complex thing to figure out, right? So if you want to make it real simple, there are obviously things that the businesses share that are clearly very sensitive, and I think we all know what those are. They could be financial records, healthcare records, corporate proprietary information. There's pretty obvious things, right? And then, of course, the kind of polarized spectrum of that is clearly things that are not sensitive, right? So you us meeting up, I emailed you only 20 minutes ago saying, "Hey, Ed, I'm in the lobby. I'm ready when you are," right? So that's something that's not sensitive. The challenge is the bit in the middle, where information can go from being clearly not sensitive to either potentially sensitive or very sensitive. And I think that's one of the real challenges in business, in understanding how that data then changes and metamorphosizes into something that could suddenly create risk for that business.
Now, you and I had talked about the risk nuance in even something as innocuous as, "Hey, Ed, I'm in the lobby." If, for example, I was a headhunter.
Right.
A little different. Or so, talk to me about that. Like the context might make something that you would think is no big deal could be a very big deal.
Right, that's really interesting. So you're dead right. So something that might on the surface be innocuous and not sensitive, exactly as you say, in the context of actually the person you're meeting or what you might be discussing, suddenly it can change and be sensitive. I would, for instance, I'd like to know if one of our customer might be meeting someone to discuss an M&A project, maybe over coffee. That might give me an advantage on potentially the market, right? Exactly right. So the challenge really is when we all share unstructured data, and that's information that either could just be free text or documents. The challenge is it really is a very blurred line, and it's not black and white. And therefore, as a result, it's quite challenging. And I think businesses ultimately need to be more mindful that there isn't such thing as these polarized spectrums, and actually, as a result, all businesses need to really look at all content in the context of who they're sharing it with.
You and I had also talked about this weird sort of circular kind of arrangement where something starts as an outline.
Right.
Maybe not a big deal, then it's fleshed out, but maybe when it's pushed out, share with me that I think that's a fascinating concept.
Yeah, so it's no different to a lot of the kind of stuff that we might when we have early stage marketing messages on product ideas and announcements, right?
A few bullet points.
Right, it might be a couple of bullet points, you might be sharing it around.
Email it out,
communicate it around, try and get kind of product market fit understanding on that. But then very quickly, as it starts to kind of grow, that messages and that information might start to kind of hive off into, well, actually, we think we're on something here. Maybe we could protect this IP. And suddenly it goes from being non-sensitive concept ideas to something that could be quite valuable. And actually then the bell curve continues, and actually suddenly it then has value, it is then sensitive. You then need to protect that content and be very mindful of who it's being shared with. And yet, interestingly, so then it goes through this life cycle whereby eventually when it's then as part of a product launch, and maybe you're launching that to all customers, and then it becomes public information, it then becomes public again, right? So you have this cycle of early stage concepts and ideas that are not often protected, but then require protection because it's kind of pre-market stuff, and then actually becomes public information again. So there is this, that's why it makes it quite a challenging space about protecting unstructured data.
You'd shared with me that there was this sort of older notion, it was very binary. It's like, is it proprietary or is it not? If it's proprietary, if I'm a corporate security data expert and it's my job to figure this out, what do I do? Do you have to acknowledge this as a spectrum, or do you pick points along the way?
I think you have to acknowledge it, but you have to change your philosophy on how you manage the risk of sharing that data. You have to not look at it as binary as, is it sensitive or is it not? But again, back to what we were saying, you have to look at the context of the information and who it's sharing to, and then apply a kind of risk score to it. Look at it in all context, and then actually start thinking of the information we share as, well, actually, what risk does this bring us today or tomorrow? And then apply kind of appropriate security at that point in time.
I would assume the markings must be somewhat important, right? The coming up with some sort of designation.
It does.
Would have to be. Are people getting better at that?
Well,
or are they getting worse?
No, you see, in our experience, that's where typically a lot of businesses are running around now employing classification schemes. It used to be something that typically government would do. But now actually it's kind of a household capability now for all businesses, where that's almost the first step in, well, can we categorize our information? Can we actually look at the data that we actually share and at least attempt to categorize it in buckets of information? But even that, there's so many barriers and boundaries where it actually transcends, but at least it's a good start.
Yeah. Let's talk some use cases where people make mistakes.
Right.
So, in my mind, it's always Alice and Bob. Alice, the corporate employee with data. Bob, not authorized for that. What are the different ways that information gets to Bob in an inappropriate manner? What are some of the use cases?
So this is fascinating now, actually, because we've always tracked kind of breaches of information security, and we've looked at them, and they're all going in the wrong direction, right? But actually, one of the things we did this year...
Getting worse.
Getting much worse. And it's seemingly, even though they're very publicized, the breaches of information security are getting worse. And there's something recently a lot of people have been talking about, which is this insider breach. And actually, when we looked at that, there was really no information that was available for customers to understand why it's happening. They understood the statistic of it's getting worse, but no one really understood why. So we looked at this in detail, and we launched a survey by talking to CISOs in the United States, employees in the United States, and then did exactly the flip side in the UK. And what was interesting, the research focused really on two sort of primary elements where data was put at risk. And the primary elements consisted of either information that was unintentionally shared with internal or external third parties that might have placed that data at risk, or information that was intentionally shared and potentially put that data at risk. Now there's a big difference here. We didn't say maliciously shared, and that's kind of almost a spin-off of that, just intentionally shared. And we felt we needed to dig into that in a bit more detail. And when we looked at into the research, it's clear that one of the biggest challenges across the enterprise globally is people just make mistakes.
Yeah.
So, and actually what was amazing about this piece of research, we'd also asked the question of why are you making mistakes? And some of the information that came out was pretty obvious to you and I, but it was good to see the data. It was people openly admitting that they are busy, that they are the pressure of time-based pressure of being able to hit deadlines, or they were tired because of the pressures of work. But the reality is, all pretty obvious things, people just unintentionally sharing information that may be sensitive, either internally, externally, and placing that data at risk. That's a big category, and it's something that CISOs are really, really worried about. But there's another element, which is individuals that are intentionally sharing that data. Now, some of that is malicious, and it might be, I'm moving roles, I'm going from this job to this job, and I want to take that data with me, and that's quite concerning. But the other one, which was more interesting to us, is actually a breakdown of understanding on, I'm intentionally sharing this information without the appropriate protection, either A, because I feel it's mine, and actually, so I don't really feel like I'm going against corporate policy, so that's an issue, or B, I just don't have the tools to do this. Right. I just don't have the capability from the business to share something that might be sensitive to a third party.
Well, those are different. Let's go back to those. So let's go back to the first one. And I think you'd shared with me, you think there might be some generational component here where I've written some code.
Yep.
Or I composed a design, or I did something. It might be a creative advertising concept or something that's mine. A younger person probably doesn't sort of assume that that's owned by the larger, whereas maybe somebody who's been at work for 20, 30 years would. Talk to me that. You told me that. I thought that was really fascinating.
Well, it was another one of the parts of the research is when you're looking at this intentional breach of information security, is there a difference between if we bucketed people in age groups? And there was. And actually what we did is we asked the question, who owns this data? Do you feel you have ownership over the data? Simple yes or no. And And it was interesting to see a scale whereby younger generation really do feel a sense of ownership over that content that they create. So interestingly, and of course it follows, that if I'm creating some information that's mine, or I believe it's mine, and then I maybe share it with to my Gmail account, or I maybe take it with me when I go to another job, I don't feel like I'm in breach of information security.
No.
I feel like it's mine anyway.
Came from my brain.
Right.
Who the heck are they to take it?
And it's interesting how obviously those that have been in industry longer, there was a shift in mindset. So that jumped off the page for us. That actually it's something that requires fundamental education to all younger generation, that when you're coming into business and you're creating either bespoke IP or information on behalf of a business, that actually it needs to be very clearly articulated, the kind of rules around sharing. And I guess it's because young people, as they're kind of now brought up on social media and they've had this sort of habit of sharing, they get out of bed in the morning, they just share your life online, right, Ed? I guess it's that almost natural, habit of sharing that can't transcend into business. There's a disconnect between that habit outside of work and that habit inside work.
Now let's take the second use case. So you said they complain, I just don't have the tools to do that. So this is a case where they know it's not right, but for whatever reason, time pressure or something. Talk to me about that one, because that one resonates. I can have that one every day.
I think almost every business globally has people in the business that are making decisions right now, exactly that, where they've got an email, they've attached some information, they're about to send it externally, and there's that moment where they're thinking, man, I kind of want to protect this, and then they start making their own self-assessment of how sensitive it is, right? And well, how sensitive is this? It's like, I can maybe right. So the reality is, I think people in business ultimately are, there's traditionally just too much friction with security, and as a result, people are kind of making their own assessments and kind of saying, I'm just going to take this risk because the business won't be. No one's going to tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, it took me another 2 hours to get that information from A to B, but I did it right, I did it securely. Everyone's going to say, hey, you missed a deadline. And that's something that's more concerning. So I think, there's a culture of, well, how sensitive is this? I'll take the risk. And I think the challenge there is that's purely because technology traditionally has just been too much friction. And actually because you've got, if it was easy and you had that confidence that you could share information that was sensitive really, really easily, and there'd be no friction for you, and more importantly, no friction for that person receiving it, then you would protect everything. But traditionally, they haven't had those tools, and as a result, they're taking a risk.
Now, you mentioned social, and we know people text, we know people print out documents and share them, and talk in the parking lot,
right?
And a million other ways to collaborate, but killer app is really email, right? Is that really it?
Yeah, look, there's more tools to share information now, right? There's collaboration tools, there's instant messaging, there is text, there's a whole myriad of ways that we can share information. And I get dragged into conversations with people all over the world where they're saying, well, is email going away? Email's not going away, and you and I both know that. In actual fact, it still remains the biggest risk to a business, but also the only capability where you can really and confidently share any level of content with any organization without thinking, are they going to get it at all? So
it's probably more like an S curve where you didn't have much. We all experienced that wave, and now email is just part of your life. Admittedly, some of the better machine learning algorithms do a pretty good job of getting some spam out of the core and so on. But you still get so many business emails. I don't see that changing in the next 5 to 10 to whatever. Maybe 20 years, I don't know. Maybe robots do it, but I don't think it changes. Am I reading that right?
No, you're dead right. And ultimately, like I say, that there is information that maybe 4 or 5 years ago that would have been communicated over email that is now being replaced with other channels. And I think that's really positive because it's new ways of working, and that's really appropriate. But there is still an overwhelming requirement to share information by email. So
send me your contract for me to review. Email.
Right. So if you can figure that out.
Send me the document we're working on.
You got it. So the other pieces around it, I mean, they're really important too, right? But I think if you can figure out the risk and the opportunity around email, then I think you're in great shape.
We've been talking for 15 minutes. We haven't mentioned your own product set at Egress. Tell me a little bit about it, how you guys address all the things we've been talking about. You have a very fine platform. Go ahead and brag a little bit.
So it kind of lends itself to a lot of these kind of issues. I mean, when we look at how we advance the platform, how we kind of iterate and deliver new capability on the platform, the way we do that is by looking at some of the real challenges in the market, and many of which we've talked about, right? It's the accidental send, it's the intentional send of information that maybe, actually, if you were more informed or more aware, maybe you would do it differently. It's the issue around what is sensitive and what it's not. So we've built a capability and launched it actually this year over RSA called risk-based protection. Now, risk-based protection is the kind of new paradigm on helping people in business really understand some of these challenges. So it looks at, before we get onto a kind of applying a degree of security, it looks at, well, actually, let's look at the content and automatically figure out how sensitive it is by looking inside the information that you're sharing. It then looks at, before it gets onto the individual user, it then looks at the business or the domain you're sharing with, and it does a bunch of really interesting checks. It looks at, well, how trusted is this domain? Is this a domain that's actually been set up for 72 hours, in which case we need to be quite mindful of that? Or is this a business I've been communicating with for a long time? It then looks at the individual and actually says, well, the individual in this business, have you ever communicated to this person before? So it's aggregating a risk score around sensitive content in relation to the people and the businesses that you're sharing with. And then ultimately it kind of surfaces to the top a capability that says, well, in this instance, at this moment in time, the most appropriate way to share this content may be using TLS, and then the technology can help automate that. Or it might be message level encryption, because again, maybe it might be a first time use, maybe it might be an untrusted domain, or maybe it might be super, super high sensitive content where you want to be sure that only the person you send it to can access that data. So there's a kind of a spectrum of delivering capability that ultimately makes life easy for people. And even though we're kind of spearheading these kind of surveys around insider breach, but we're not demonizing people. We're not saying you're the problem. We're actually trying to say, let's flip this on its head and say, the challenge is actually technology suppliers need to provide capability that helps protect people from themselves to some extent for making mistakes, but give them a tool that they genuinely really rely upon. And actually, as opposed to saying, oh, this is another data security tool that I would really rather not have because it actually lowers productivity, it actually completely turns that on its head and increases productivity because it helps take away decisions they don't need to make. It helps remove mistakes very proactively that they're about to make, really delivering value to people. So we call it people-centric data security.
How easy to integrate with major platforms, Microsoft being sort of the obvious one? Is it an easy integration?
Well, it has to be right. So we integrate with Microsoft platforms, G Suite platforms, all of those kind of main player platforms across the enterprise.
Just tangles right in.
It absolutely does. And yet one of the real advantages that we've found, because for many years we've delivered this kind of protection and threat-based analysis on both the edge and at the endpoint. What's really neat about that is if any capability makes it through some of those outbound defenses and gets to the desktop, you can also pick up as a last line of defense on potentially where someone's trying to either spoof an individual and actually maybe as part of a spear phishing threat, where again, because it's looking at domain, it's looking at individual, it can also pick up on some of those risks where actually an individual's actually potentially attempted to be compromised. So it's about delivering all this capability at the endpoint and wrapping these tools around end users to ultimately make their lives easier, but really deliver them value.
There's a compliance component as well, I would think, with the GDPR and other kinds of frameworks. Well, even if you don't buy into what you and I love, our cybersecurity, you may buy in because it helps you with compliance issues.
Well, the reality is that's still a driver, right? Ultimately we're trying to deliver a capability that makes end users more productive, but there is a core compliance driver here about making sure that any information that poses a risk to the business has the appropriate level of security and it doesn't put the business at risk just by an innocuous mistake.
Well, I'm sure people appreciate that. So now you've been at this a while. I'm going to ask you to make a couple of predictions. Where do you see is sort of this cyber threat headed? And I know you focus on data security. We were saying things are getting worse.
Yeah.
So are you optimistic that maybe this turns the corner, or are you pessimistic and you see, like here in the US in particular, we tend to think in terms of catastrophes.
Right.
Like we float along and then a catastrophe happens. That's an inflection point, and we usually make things better. But we wait for catastrophes, very American sort of thing. How do you think about that? Do you think things will get better on their own, or
they're not going to get better on their own. And ultimately, a lot of the compliance regulation that actually is being delivered globally, and GDPR is part of that, NYDFS, California privacy, it's designed, these are kind of vehicles to kind of drive behavior. And I think that's a good thing. But the reality is, do I think it's going to get better? I have to believe it's going to get better. But I really believe that not by doing the things that we've always done and expecting a different outcome. I think it's only going to get better if technology suppliers like ourselves kind of look at the tools that we have available and actually try and deliver capability that we haven't been able to deliver before. So it's ultimately about, we've got to try and solve really, really complex problems. And in the world of, hey, I want to share information, I'm not sure if it's sensitive, I might be busy and make mistakes, and you're also trying to catch either intentional malicious or intentional unknown. These are really, really difficult problems to solve. So, but I think it's the only way we're actually going to get there. So I absolutely do believe it's going to get better. But I believe it's only going to do that by using the latest in machine learning and actually really embedding that into kind of core kind of business process.
Well, that's upbeat. I like to hear that. So good. That's fantastic. Well, I appreciate you coming to visit. I would imagine if people want to learn a little more, visit your website.
Egress.com. There's tons of stuff we can. Thought leadership white papers is a great. The study, the Insider Breach study that we've issued is available online.
You can download that as a PDF.
There's some incredible, really interesting kind of information there that people can access and understand whether that they feel that applies to their business. So by all means, check out online and see how you get on.
Well, thank you for stopping by our studio.
Pleasure, Ed. Great to see you.
It's always wonderful to chat with you. Nice to see you. And we'll see you next time.